morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining me from. Thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to be with me this morning for this 1 hour on managing user stories for effective development and testing. All right, this webinar is hosted by Rommana Software. I'm the leader in integrated application lifecycle management. I will spend most of the hour talking about user stories and how you manage user stories in an agile project. At the end of the webinar, if we have time, I would like to spend maybe 20 minutes or so to show you how Rommana ALM actually help you manage user stories. If you have any question about the contents of the webinar, please feel free to click the questions tab and put your question there, and I will be checking those questions as I am talking, I'm speaking, so I will be able to address your questions one at a time. Here are some facts about user stories. If you have been using user stories in your agile projects, then you probably know all these. They are very brief. They're short statements. In case some of you have not seen user stories before, let me give you a quick example. A user story would be like this. As a customer, I'd like to be able to check the status of my order online. As a customer, I would like to be able to change my shipping address before the order is shipped. Or perhaps just I'd like to be able to change my shipping address. As a customer, I'd like to pay for the order using my credit card. So with that being said, as you can tell, this is a very brief, high-level statement of the requirement. It's just a different form of the requirement. Okay. Very often we take a requirement and break it down into a number of user stories. But also, very often we have user stories that are big, that are huge. We call them epic. For example, as a customer, I'd like to be able to place orders online. That's a huge user story. It has a lot of details to it, and perhaps that user story will be broken down, or that epic would be broken down to things like, I'd like to be able to pay by credit card. I'd like to be able to change my address. I'd like to be able to do all kinds of other things that has to do with placing an order. So we take the epic, we break it down. Now, whether it is an epic, i.e. a large user story, or it is low-level user story, there is still very high level, there is still very brief. I'm sure you've seen that. Now, we also know that some people, when they write user stories, they'd like to put something at the end of the user story that says, so that whatever. And that should explain the reason for the user story. And some people say that the so that will give you some context. Well, that is not 100% true. Because if I were to take a user story like, as a customer, I'd like to be able to change my shipping address. So that what? What would you put after the so that clause? Nothing useful, really. As a customer, I'd like to be able to change my shipping address so that I get my order at a different address. That still does not provide much of a context. So my position is that user stories, no matter what, whether you use so that or not, they do not provide any context. If you have a different opinion, please go ahead and share that on the questions panel, and I will questions tab, and I will share this with others. Of course, if you've used the user stories, you might have also used the story points to estimate how much effort it would take to implement the user story. You know, again, I've used the story points, I've used the time estimates. They're both difficult because when you don't have enough details, it's very hard to estimate how much effort it's going to take to implement the user story. I mean, we already had enough hard time working with requirements, and even requirements normally provide much more details than user story. That's exactly why, to me, using user stories is difficult. Again, one more time, if you have different experience, I'm willing to learn from you so that you can go ahead and share your opinion or experience through the questions tab. So here is an example. I forgot that I have an example on my slides, but that's a somewhat complex user story. It might be broken into other smaller user stories. Okay, now let me give you those observations about user stories that I have been able to experience in my projects when I use the user stories. When I'm going to say when I am forced to use user stories in some agile projects. Now, as you know, the format of the user stories is always as a user role, a customer, a person, whatever. And I'm going to make that statement very clear. Not everything the system must do or the system does involves a user. There is a lot of things that the system will do on its own that's not of interest to any user. As a result, it becomes difficult to say as a certain role, I'd like to do that. I mean, simple thing. System calculates state sales taxes at the rate of 8% on each order. Okay, is that something that would be interest of the customer placing the order? No. Can I say things like, as a customer, I want to see the system calculating the state sales taxes at the rate of 8%? I doubt it. Again, one more time, if you've been using user stories and you found a way to state such requirement in the form of a user story, please share with me. Because in my own experience, I keep those things as requirements or business rules or whatever you want to call it, whatever we called them before the era of user stories. We did not have user stories all the time. I've been working with requirement management / user story management for the last 37 years. Requirement management is a huge field that I have learned and I have taught to thousands and thousands of people around the globe. When we started to use user stories, I found out that we need to manage user stories the same way we managed requirements. And even we should do a much better job in managing user stories because they don't have the same level of details that requirements has. We will get into all that during the webinar. Okay, so not everything the system does is necessarily involving the customer or a user or any other role in the system. The system does things on its own. There are so many processes the system will do no matter what. Okay, again, one more time, if you found a way to express those in the form of a user story, please share with us any example, like the example I just mentioned. System must calculate state sales taxes at the rate of 8% on every order. All right. What is this shall not do thing? From the beginning, from years and years ago, I've been teaching people about shall not do requirements. When we wrote requirements, when we still write requirements, and when we write user stories, we always talk about what the system shall do. We rarely speak about what the system shall not do. There are so many things the system shall not do. I refer to those as negative requirements. I know it's a weird term that you probably have not read about in any place, but what else can I call them? I can call them shall not do requirements or negative requirements. Let me give you an example. If I am talking about the requirement or the user story about customer placing an order, I think you would agree that there has to be a shall not do requirement that says something like the system shall not ship the order more than once. I know we don't write those. When we write requirements, when we write user stories, we never write these things. If we're talking about a requirement about the system assigning seats to people, for example, the system shall assign first class seats to passengers on a first come, first serve. Again, one more time, this has nothing to do with the user. So that falls under my first bullet there. So, but the system does it anyway. I mean, the system does a lot of things, by the way, with respect to, say, assigning seats that have nothing to do with the user. I mean, the most the user will say is, as a passenger or as a customer, I'd like to be able to select my seat. But all the kind of processing that the system must do and all the kind of business rules the system must follow in the process of assigning seats cannot ever be expressed in the form of a user story. But you better believe it that there is a hidden implicit shall not do requirement that says, or that should say, the system shall not assign the same seat to more than one person. Again, one more time, when we write the requirement that has to do with assigning a seat, we never put that down. And again, I keep teaching people about those shall not or negative requirements because they are essential, they are important and must be tested, but they're not written in the requirement. And that's why I overcome the problem through the concept of scenarios. If you are interested to know about how to do this, then you can review my webinar on scenario-based development and testing. It should be available at the Rommana software website. So if something like this rule or business rule that the system shall not assign the same seat to more than one person, if it is missing, then instead of going back and modifying the requirement, which many people would not like, because many people will say, no, the requirements cannot be changed. And of course, I cannot go back and change the user story because there is no way to express such business rule in the user story. So I take the easy way and put this in the form of a scenario. Okay. And I don't state it exactly as a requirement. When we write scenarios, we write them differently. I say, you know, someone is trying to get the same seat that someone else has. And that's a scenario that will cover the negative requirement I'm referring to. The bottom line is that user stories are not very good at stating shall not do or negative requirements. Now, someone says, well, but the problem also exists in requirements. Well, not exactly, because if I were using requirements, I can simply state that business rule. I can simply say, system shall not assign the same seat to more than one person. The same way I would say, system shall calculate state sales taxes at the rate of 8% on each order. So writing requirements gives me some flexibility. Writing user stories in the format where you know does not give me that kind of flexibility. Okay, quality requirements are very important. As you probably know by now, we have the functional requirements, the things that have to do with the functionalities that are supported by the system. But we also have, on the other hand, other kind of requirements, and one of them is quality requirements, the things that have to do with response time, performance, reliability, all these safety, security, all these kind of things. And I have not found a way to express any of those things in the form of a user story. So when I am forced to use user story in one of the projects, and you better believe it, I go and help many projects writing the requirements / user stories. And when I am forced to work with a project that uses user story, I keep those quality requirements as requirements. I don't try to struggle to put them in the form of a user story. One more time, if any one of you had different experience being able to express quality requirements in the form of user stories, please go ahead and shoot an example at me on the questions tab. I'm peeking here on the questions tab to see if there's anything there. Yeah, just to click on the questions tab, provide an example for me, a user story example that shows how to write a quality requirement. All right. Because although quality is very important, but we cannot put it in the form of a user story. I hate to say that, and I don't want to say that those quality requirements are not of interest to a user. Of course they are. They are, and I would be mistaken if I tell you they're not. But yet, we cannot put something like response time shall not exceed 30 seconds for every customer query in the form of user story. Maybe you can tweak it a little bit and say, as a customer, I'd like to get a response within 30 seconds. But there are so many other quality requirements that has to do with safety, security, reliability that you may not be able to. One more time, if you have been able to express your quality requirements in the form of a user story, please let me know. Maybe I should have checked at the beginning of the webinar how many of those who are attending with me today are actually working on projects that use user stories. If you are, please go ahead and raise your hand. Because if I'm not getting any responses, okay, all right. Well, I got a very good number of people here. I'm not able to count who are using user stories. So you can probably help me. Some of you can help me, kind of verify or at least confirm what I'm talking about. Either right or wrong. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking that we have a discussion here. If any of those claims I'm putting on the screen are not, they do not match with your experience, please provide your experience on the questions tab, and I'm happy to share it with others without sharing your name. All right. Okay. So because of everything I said so far, if you're going to take user stories and start designing your tests based on that, or developers would take user stories and build their design and code, I'm going to tell you this is not going to work. It has not worked when we use the requirements, and it will never work when we use user stories. Okay, because user stories did not make the situation any better. Again, I've been teaching people for so many years that you cannot take a requirement and just started designing your tests. Although we have something out there called requirement-based testing. But again, in my scenario-based approach, which is explained in a different webinar, I have overcome this because when we deal with requirements, even requirements typically has more details than user stories, but they're still not detailed enough to write our test cases and our test scripts. And I'm going to say user stories did not make it any better. User stories did not make them any better. It did not improve the situation. In fact, user stories, because how brief they are, they make the situation even much more difficult. When I looked at user stories, I found that really, if you think of user stories the way you are supposed to manage them, they're not as simple as they appear. They're not. They're very complicated. And I'm going to always say, if you must use user story in one of your agile projects, you must use best practices in user stories. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. Okay? User story management best practices. And how did I come up with those? I took all the best practices that I've been teaching people and I've been practicing for the last 35 years, and I said, okay, how much of this apply to user stories? And I found almost everything we did in requirement management, which is a huge field, by the way. Some people call it requirement engineering. Some people call it requirement management. I don't care about one or the other. It's the whole concept of managing requirements. Every good practice that we had in requirement management apply to user story. Let me try as quick as I can, because there are 12 of those. Okay, there are 12 best practices. And one more time, the roots of those practices coming from requirement management. When I discuss those practices with you now, again, if you have different opinion or different experience that some of those practices do not apply to user stories, then let me know. The first one is simple. The same way requirements exist in a hierarchy of details, user stories exist in a hierarchy of details. I already told you that. We have epics, which are huge user stories that we can break down into smaller user stories. So we have to be able to support that concept of hierarchy of user stories. I call it hierarchy. You might call it hierarchy. You got to live with the way I pronounce some of the words. You know, over 42 years now speaking English, I still have my own vocab that I pronounce them differently. All right. So if we are using a tool to manage user stories, the tool must allow us to show and manage user stories in the form of a hierarchy of details. High-level user stories, lower-level user stories, lower-level user stories. So a tool that does not allow you this, in my opinion, is not a good tool. All right. I hope you already know this from your experience using user stories. The details of a user stories may change over time. Now, of course, someone says, well, but the user story is simple. It is simple. But the details behind them will change over time. That's why when we manage user stories, we have to keep track of the history of the changes in the details of the user stories. Now, I don't know if you do that or not. One more time, if you're using user stories in an Agile project and you're doing one of those things, please share with me. I am a guy who believes in processes, and I don't believe in changes just to happen like that. For changes to happen, someone has to submit what we call a change request, and that is the whole field of change management. I don't care about the format or how formal the change request is, but there has to be a request made by someone, whether it is the product owner, one of the team members, a customer, I don't care. But someone should have said, this user story needs also to handle this. Or someone should say, this user story should not do this, but rather do that. User stories or the details of user stories will change over time, whether you like it or not. That's why the history of the changes must be there. The change requests must be there. And also, you may want to maintain different versions of user stories. Of course. If we are working with one user story, that over time has changed. And now the user story has been implemented by the development team as is being tested by the test team. Now someone comes up with a change in the way the user story should be implemented. The question becomes, where are we going to do those changes and how we're going to handle those? So user story versioning is an essential thing in user story management. I will leave it at that. So any tool that you're using for managing your user stories should allow you to do those three things, absolutely, in order to support what's called user story change management. This is the second bullet. All right. Of course, it goes without saying, we all know that user stories must be reviewed, collaboratively reviewed by all project teams. However, if you are working in a project that deals with some regulated industry, believe it or not, medical device or otherwise, we have situations where the user story must be approved, and we cannot go on with the development effort and the testing effort before getting it approved. So approval of a user story is not much different from the approval of a requirement. So there has to be a process of approving a user story. And that must be built within the tool that help you manage your user stories. There is no point of using a tool, Jira or whatever, to put our user stories there, and we have no way of approving it or disapproving it. And we have no way of collaboratively reviewing it in the tool. I'm going to have to believe that most tools out there that allow you to manage user stories will allow you to review user stories. I'm not sure all of them allow you to establish what I call the approval authority on a user story. And now keep in mind, this is only needed when you work in an environment that's a regulated environment where you have to approve or disapprove the user story. I need to go faster because I'm still at number 4 of the best practices. I'm looking for some interactions from the audience. Some reactions, yes or no, agree or not agree, your experience is different or not, because otherwise I'm going to think that you are logging into my webinar, but you're getting busy doing other things. And keep in mind, this tool that I'm using here, the GoToWebinar tool, tells me if you are busy doing other things or not. It kind of spies on you. I see a symbol next to you here that tells me what you're doing. So not gonna announce this to everybody, but I have a number of you who are busy doing other things. Using the keyboard, using your mouse. If you're doing that, then the tool tells me that. Okay, I'm not going to control what you do. I'm grateful that you found time at least to listen to me, and maybe you are a very good multitasking person who knows how to listen to me and understand everything and still do other useful job. But again, I'd like to get some reactions from those of you attending with me today, because it's not fair that you only learn from me. It's also fair that I learn from you, right? You agree? All right. It goes without saying. The same way we did with requirements, user stories will relate to each other. There are some relationships, different types of relationships between the user stories. Some user stories have to be implemented before other user stories. Some user stories must be tested at the same time with other user stories, and so on. So a tool that helps you manage user stories must also allow you to manage the relationship between user stories. Okay? Trying to peek into the questions tab. No one wants to put anything for me out there. Okay. All right. Use cases. I don't know how many of you actually know about use cases. Use cases are different from requirements, and they are different from use cases, from user stories. Use cases are huge structures that shows a number of things. I'm not going to, of course, take the time in this webinar to explain use cases, but I'm going to tell you that use cases care about the interactions between different parts of the system and different types of users. So in a way, use cases are more of an interactive model, or I should say interaction model. It shows you how a user will interact with the system, how the system will interact with other systems, and so on. And we write use cases in a much more details, and use cases have scenarios or paths. We call them main paths or primary path versus alternative path. If you have worked with the user stories, you know that. Now, I'm not going to ever exclude the concept that a user story could possibly have a use case associated with it. If the user story is something like, as a customer, I'd like to place an order online. Okay, you can imagine this can be broken down to a number of use cases, or it could be converted to a use case that has a number of scenarios. Now, one more time, please. If you have not used the use cases, it's going to be hard for me to explain that one. All right. Hopefully, when I turn into showing you the Rommana ALM tool, I might be able to show you an example. Okay. But the bottom line is, use cases will provide so much more details about your user stories. And in some projects, it would be the biggest mistake not to use use cases in connection with user stories. All right. Not sure if you encounter this or not, because user stories are typically brief. Then we must be able to associate user stories with some design models. I mean, when the development team takes a user story and actually started the designing of this functionality, there are some design models. There are some decision tables. There are some activity diagrams. There are some interaction diagrams. All these are design components that help us implement user stories. And as a result, we have to have those also reflected in the user story management tool. Okay, again, keep that in mind until I show you some examples or show you how to do this in the tool. Okay, risks. Risks are there in every project, whether it is agile or non-agile, whether we're using user stories or using requirements. Risks, and the risks I'm referring to here are what I refer to as project risks. Project risks. And those are the risks that will hinder us from implementing or delivering the user story as promised. Okay. Now, I know even when we talk about requirement management, many project managers do not really even associate risks with requirements. But that is one of the best practices in requirement management. And I'm telling you today, it is also a big part of user story management. You have to know for each user story if there is any risk that could possibly, anything that could possibly happen that could hinder us from delivering the user story or delivering the functionality supported by the user story. Things like a third-party component may not be available on time for us to finish the user story. Things like the code for the user story has not been reviewed up to until 3 days before release. Things like a piece of hardware that we're supposed to use during the testing of that user story has not been implemented, has not been built yet. Because we're talking here about user stories for embedded systems, okay? And embedded systems mean that there is hardware and software there. But any possible risk must be there. I'm gonna go a little bit faster here. Okay. Tasks, of course. It strikes me badly sometimes when people say, okay, this person is going to work with that user story. Wrong. There's no one person that works with the user story. If you look at the user story, it's not like anything else we want to perform, and it has tasks associated with them. Tasks such as reviewing the user story, writing the design for the user story, writing the code for the user story, writing the test cases, and running the test cases, and writing the test scripts, and retesting bugs. All these are tasks, and I have to wonder, do we ever keep track of those tasks? Or all those tasks are lumped together into one thing that's called completing the user story. Okay. In order to understand what I'm referring to here, I want you to also review my webinar on feature-based project management. Feature-based project management. In this webinar, I speak about tasks associated with user stories and or requirements. And we have to keep track of those tasks because we need to know which task has been completed, which task is being performed by who, and so on. All right. Good enough on that. Of course, traceability is very important. If you're working with in some regulated environment, they will tell you, of course, all the time that requirement traceability is essential. And you have to show that. And there is such a thing called the requirement traceability matrix. Nothing has changed when we use user stories. So we have user story traceability matrix. We must. And the traceability matrix shows relationship between user stories and many other things, not only testing, but code modules. Like in the next practice number 10 here, as you can see it, user stories must be traced back to test cases. That's part of, so 9 and 10 are very much what I refer to as user story traceability. Tracing to the code modules, tracing to the test cases, and any tool you use to manage your user stories must allow you to do that. Absolutely. If you cannot trace your user stories back to the code that developers have written or to the design components that developers have designed, then it's a useless tool to me. Absolutely. Now, I believe number 11 is the one that you do. Okay, user stories have acceptance criteria. That's if you use acceptance criteria, but also must have scenarios, and I have reasons for that. Again, some people say, well, using acceptance criteria, I don't need scenarios. If you want to understand number 11, please review my. Actually, I'm doing next week, same time here on Friday. Next Friday, I'm doing the webinar on acceptance criteria versus scenarios. I hope to see you there because that will help you understand when you use acceptance criteria, when you use scenarios, and when you use both. Okay? So a tool that helps me manage user stories must allow me to manage the relationship between a user story and requirements, and acceptance criteria, as well as the relationship between user stories and scenarios. Okay. The last thing, number 12, is that, believe it or not, user stories are of different types. Same way requirements are of different types. I already told you we have functional user stories. We have non-functional user stories, like examples are quality things. Now, quality things, we said we cannot express them in user stories, so they're gonna, I keep them as requirements. But we have other things such as regulations. We have other things such as business rules. We have other things such as whatever. Organizational rules. We have design decisions, and some people say, well, if they are designed, they're not requirements or not user stories. Well, I want you to relax that misconception for now, because there might be some time that a design constraint that must be used, must be enforced by the system, and we have to state it. Again, because of number 12, I'm suggesting that a tool must allow you to express or define different types of user stories. I think I spent a reasonable amount of time. I only have 20 minutes left. Very quick here. This picture sums it all. It puts user story at the center of attention and puts everything we talked about around it. Just to tell you how complex user story is. The user story by itself is simple. It's simple, but you cannot take a user story in isolation from everything around us. Okay, and those are the things I mentioned. There might be a few other things that I didn't even put in the picture, but I wanted to keep my picture simple and pretty for you. All right, this is critical. Take this picture, show it to your agile team, show it to your product owner and say, do we do any of this? And a tool, if you're using a tool to manage your user stories, the tool must allow you to do all this. Issues, I did not even talk about issues. You have to be able to associate issue reports, whether you call them bug reports or whatever, back to the user story. And you have to establish that traceability. That's part of traceability. Okay? All right, so keep that picture in mind. Feel free to take that picture if you think it's useful. Print it on a big chart and put it somewhere in your cubicle, in your hallways. I want people to see how user story management works. Okay. Time now, it's about 15 minutes left. And I want to give you a glimpse at Rommana ALM, which is a fully integrated application lifecycle manager that does everything from requirements and user story management to project management, test design, document management. Use cases are here, collaboration, issue management and bug tracking, change management, everything in one box. And this is the database. This is the Rommana ALM repository, which is simple SQL database. Okay, it also integrates with subversion for code version control, and that's why you see the integration here between the user stories and the version control tool. It also integrates with Jira, Bugzilla, and the UFT from HP. Okay, this is just a simple picture that shows the components of Rommana ALM. If it is okay with you, let me spend the next 15 minutes or so to kind of show you how Rommana ALM allows you to do all the kind of things I did, but I have 15 minutes to spend. If you don't care about the tool, please feel free to leave now. But this is a website for Rommana ALM, by the way. I happen to have the packages and the pricing on the screen here. Please, I encourage you to go ahead if you like the interface as I'm going to show you in a minute. Go ahead and try it for free. You get a 60 days free trial for up to 3 people of your team members. Okay. You can try any component you want. The RM has to do with requirements and user stories. The RM and TM has to do with requirements, user stories, and the test management as well. So the components are like that. So these what we refer to them as packages. This package here has the requirement management, user story management, the test management, and the issue management. If you're interested in the whole complete Rommana ALM is down here. It has all the 8 components here. You can certainly try it free for 60 days. All right. So with that, I'm going to go here and just log into Rommana ALM. This is a site. When you try it for free, you get a site like this. Whatever site name you choose, and is going to be dot is going to be a subdomain of Rommana.com. All right. I'm just this is one of the sites we have for testing. So I'm going to just log here. And because I have the privilege of both site manager and the product owner and the project manager, I get this window. So I'm going to log in as a product owner, project manager, or Scrum Master. When I do that, I get this screen that that shows me the different projects I'm part of, and guess what? It shows me on the left here the different systems or products, if you will. Again, because we use this for demos and examples and testing, we have different dummy applications here. One of them is, believe it or not, is Rommana ALM as an application. So the projects you see on the right here are all projects that has to do with the product Rommana ALM. And if I open this project here, the first thing I see, so every project has its own database. There are 3 tabs here. So the project dashboard is here, and that shows you the different, the dashboard with different statistics, and you can customize this very much. And it tells you some data that you need to see. And again, as I said, you can scroll down to see other things. Here, everything on the dashboard, every number on any report is clickable, as you can see. If I want to look at those critical issues or those issues that someone has declared as critical, I can simply click on this red bar. It gives me all those issues that are critical. So I'm going to close that. All right. So this is the dashboard. This is the project activity diagram. And this is the project workflow. I'm not going to get into this, but let me click here. Here are user stories. Here are all the things you can do with Rommana ALM. Project managing the project is here. User stories are here. Your change requests are here. All your test sets are here. Documents, issues, and you can go here further for more. You see some ad hoc tests here. You can see the use cases, and you can go to the collaboration center to do a number of things, initiate a user story review, scenario reviews, whatever. All right, so everything is on this screen. There's nothing that you can do in Rommana ALM that's not on this screen, which a lot of people say that makes life very easy for them, because they can easily look here and see where things are. Now, let me just click on user stories here so that I can see the user stories. As I promised you, as I mentioned in my first practice, here is the hierarchy of my user stories. Okay, so simple, very simple. So I have a user story here, an epic that says, as a user, I want to be able to configure attribute values for different project entities. Remember, this is a user story that has to do with the Rommana ALM application. Now, this epic or that huge user story has been decomposed to those 5 different user stories. Okay, same is true here. As a user, I want to be able to import requirements from different sources. Okay, one of the sub requirements here, or some of the user stories, as a user, I want to import requirements from another Rommana project. Okay, so I can now click on any one of those user stories to get the details. And that's where all the details are that I'm going to be able to show you. Of course, a user story has a description here. Okay, again, because I use it for testing, so you see things like that. So never mind these things. This user story does not have acceptance criteria yet, but I can easily add acceptance criteria here. So that's how, excuse me. I'm going to just for the case of example here, I'm going to say acceptance criteria 1. Okay. Sorry. 2. I'm just showing you how easy it is to add acceptance criteria. So now a user story have both acceptance criteria and scenarios, as we're going to show here. So scenarios are here, but this user story does not have scenarios. But look at the acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria, you can say if it has been tested or not, and if it has been tested, you have to say if it passed or failed or not. Okay, you can delete, you can modify your acceptance criteria, and so on. Let me go and look at another. So as I said, acceptance criteria not only, user stories not only have acceptance criteria, but must also have scenarios. And if I click here, because I don't have a number here, then I don't have scenarios. Okay, so if I click here, it will tell me that. And I can start defining scenarios if I wanted to. If I click on new, it gives me the scenario screen. I can define scenarios. All right, very simple. So again, I'm not going to talk about scenarios today. Scenario name, description, expected behavior, and the risk factors here, frequency and impact of failure. Of course, the reason we need scenarios is because user stories do not allow us to do any of this. Okay, I'm going to close this. So Rommana keeps the windows open for you. Now, I'd like to be able to go back. I made the changes, but I don't want to save any changes. Now back here, so let me try to get into a user story that possibly have some scenarios. Okay, this user story, for example, here, you look at this number. It has 8 scenarios. So if I click here, here are the 8 scenarios. If I want to see any scenario, I click on it. It gives me the details of that scenario. And it even gives me the test cases and the ad hoc tests that have been written for that scenario, if any. Okay? And keep an eye on this, what we call the breadcrumbs at the top. I'm looking at scenario number 37, but this was for the user story number 6. If I ever want to go back to the user story, I can go like that. Okay, so now I'm looking at the user story. Let's continue here. All right. I'm peeking here into the questions tab. There's a bunch of questions here. I'm going to try to address them very quick. One question says, would the scenarios be in the test cases? Well, the shortest answer to your question is no. But the more detailed answer is this. Scenarios are higher level than test cases. Scenarios are what I call test ideas. So you write your scenarios first. So you take a user story, you break it down into a number of scenarios, then for each one of those scenarios, you build your test cases. Again, one more time, my webinar on scenario-based development and testing, which you should be able to see it here on the Rommana website. You simply go here to educational webinars, and it's going to be one of the recorded webinars there. Okay, scenario-based development and testing. This will explain it. All right, and I might get into some of that details next week when I speak about acceptance criteria versus scenarios. I got almost a comment here. I'm going to try to read it quick. I don't know if it is a comment or a question. I think there is a question at the end. We use user stories with acceptance criteria and also have a specification document we write based off those user stories, okay? Some of our teams have trouble differentiating the acceptance criteria from the specifications, which is the requirement. Any advice on that? Oh, okay. Perhaps this question would be much more to address in this webinar. I think it would be better to address it in the acceptance criteria webinar next week. If you're going to be with me next week, please remember to ask that question again, please. If I remember, I will address it, but I will address it only if I see you attending, okay? Sorry about that. I have only 3 minutes left. No, to address this, it's going to be huge time, a lot of time for me. All right, let's keep going here. All right, so what other practices they showed you? Here, for example, relationship between user stories and other user stories. Okay, and here are they. And when I look here, I don't have any other user stories related to this user story. If I did, I would have a number here. Okay, so I can define another user story that's related to the user story, and here it is. If I do this, add a user story, it will allow me to see all my user stories on the left here. I can easily say, okay, this user story actually is related to the one I am working with. So all what I have to do is to move it to the right. Now I am done. I can save. All right, now I can done this. Now you can see right away, related user story, I have another one related user story there. Okay, so the screens refresh itself right away. So that's the relationship between user stories and other user stories. Here's a relationship between user stories and issues, issue reports. I have one issue report here for this user story. Okay, if I click here, it tells me that here is the issue report that was generated for that user story. It also shows me that it is in green color because that means that it's closed. Okay, it's closed. If I were to open it here, the status is actually closed. Down here, here's the history. And the last thing, it was closed on December 3rd, 2010. And it shows you the history. So that's how Rommana ALM manage issue reports and connect them to user stories. Okay, so I'm going to close this. I'm going to close this. Back here to this screen, documents and models here. If I have any design model, any document that provides me more details about the user story, then it would be here. But because I don't have a number here, so I don't have documents. I can attach one for now. Here are test cases, for example. So in Rommana ALM, we have two different types of test cases: ad hoc tests versus designed or pre-designed tests. If I click here, it shows me all the ad hoc tests that were written for this for this user story, and all of them are in green because the status of all of them are passed. If I'm interested in looking at one of them, then here is the details. If for any reason I decide to I rerun this test case and it fails, and I go here and it changes the user. I'm actually shifting now just to talk about test cases a little bit. So there's a spelling issue here. I'm going to say change. Okay, now it's just going through the rest of the spelling checker. Now see this interesting thing, because I'm changing the status of the test case to a fail. It tells me that the Rommana methodology strongly recommends that you create an issue report. Okay, because I don't have an issue report. I had one issue report that was closed. Remember that? It was closed, and that's why, and it was closed, and the test case, because the test case passed. Now it wants me to create an issue report. I can say yes, and this will create a new issue report, or I could say no, and I go back to that issue report that's associated with the user story and reopen it again. It depends if that failure was because of that issue report that in fact someone marked it as closed, but it should not have been, or not. Okay, I'm going to close all that. If I say yes, as you can see, it's going to take me to the issue report screen. It allows me to create an issue report. It copies stuff from the description of the issue of the test case into the issue report. Let me close this. Let me close that. All right. And with that, I am 1 minute beyond my time. Again, from this screen, the user story screen, you can see everything about the user story. You can see tasks, you can see actions, you can see risks, you can see the history of changes, you can see all the versions of the user story, you can see all the change requests that have been submitted for that change requests. You can see all the test sets and all the test cases, and the approval, the reviews are here, the online reviews are here, and the approval authority if you work in some regulated environment where you would like to approve that requirement, that user story. Okay, and even here tells you that if you care to to declare that user stories as being reused or not. Okay, I think I'm going to have to stop here. I'm sorry I didn't have enough time to show you all the 12 practices within Rommana ALM, but I think it's enough to show you this screen so that you can see that everything is here. All the 12 practices are here on this screen. With that, I'd like to thank all of you for being with me today on this webinar. Don't forget to sign up for the webinar next week on acceptance criteria versus scenarios. Also, this webinar right now is being recorded and will be available at the Rommana website here under webinars. It would be added to this page here. So this is a scenario-based development and testing that I suggested some of you should look at it. All right, but this is a recording from 2019, I believe, of the same webinar. You don't have to look at it anymore. Actually, this will be removed today once we put the new recording in there. This is an old recording, so it does not use the most recent interface of the tool. So thank you again. Don't forget to go and get a free trial of Rommana ALM, any one of the components or the whole thing. Again, thank you so much for your time.